contemporary application of this before I leave you. In terms of market value, consumption accounted for 9 trillion of the $13.4 trillion GDP in 2006. Investment, you can see, government spending, net exports. Well, you notice here, net exports is a negative number. One of the reasons why this is a negative number is because the United States, as a country, we as a people like to buy much more than we produce. And because of that, we import a lot of goods that we like to buy with our money, while we export very little to foreign countries, which creates a negative trade balance. Notice, though, that the negative trade balance is only $698 billion as compared to all this positive consumption, investment, and government spending. Out of all of these, let's look at the percentage of GDP for each year. You can see that 70% of the GDP in this year came from consumer-driven consumption. Maybe now you can figure out why the news channels are constantly talking about consumer spending and how many people are spending and buying and why the holiday seasons are so important, etc. Investment and government spending, you can see there at those percentages. In 2000, GDP was 9 trillion and the components were as follows: 6, 1.7 trillion, 1.7 trillion for government spending, and 380 billion in net exports. You could see, if we made a comparison from 2006 to 2000, that in many of these situations, a few points stand out. Consumption obviously drives the economy. I mean, this is a 6-year time period, and consumption is driving it. I mean, it's very similar in numbers, 69 to 70%. We also notice that government, if you take a look at it, has been picking up some of the slack of business investment in those recent years, and has been doing that even more so recently. So the data can actually tell you a lot. You can see here, the trade deficit, it's not killing the economy, but it's definitely a drag on the economy, and it's a negative number pulling back on growth. Real GDP. What are we not worried about in real GDP? And that's one of the things you're going to get to. How many things do we count? How many things do we not count in GDP? Before we start learning this, the items that are not included, let's remember what the definition again. Remember, it's the market value of all final goods and services produced inside a country in a specific period of time. Items not included, things produced at home, but not sold in a market. Okay? If you grow food in a garden, you're not going to count that in GDP for a country. Things that are produced at home, again, are not sold in any markets. Home improvement, for instance. Another big one, illegal transactions, drug transactions, prostitution, underground activities that are something that will be on the black market, for instance, are not included in figures of GDP. The sale of stocks and bonds and investments is not a production of anything at all. It is not included in GDP. Again, sale of stocks and bonds, an IOU. This government bond is an IOU. I will pay you later with interest. Bonds do not produce anything, thus they are not included in GDP figures. Also, the sale of used goods. Used goods were counted as a part of GDP in the year that they were produced. We don't want to count them again. So you can see we want to be as accurate as we possibly can. If a bicycle was produced and counted in GDP in 2003 and it is resold in 2004, we don't want to count that resale in 2004 for 2004's GDP, so we don't double count. Also, the value of leisure time. There's no price that you can really place on that across the board. And because some people are more productive than others when they work and when they don't work, and how much leisure time, that we don't include that in the figures either. Social well-being is also something else. We don't include it in GDP. If GDP increases because people work longer hours, this may not increase people's well-being. Social costs, we've talked about this in microeconomics with the discussion of externalities, negative externalities especially, again, are not considered in GDP figures. These negative costs passed on to third parties, unfortunately, aren't counted in the national accounting. Okay, this is actually from Refenomics, and there's actually a GDP multiple choice test link here if you wanted to take a look at this information. The website is free. I'll make sure that I link this website for you so you can come back to it and do some of the calculations, play with it. Before I leave you, I want you to take a look at another very good website. This is actually from the U.S. Department of Commerce, Bureau of Economic Analysis. It's some really great graphs that you can play around with. I'll make sure you have the link to that as well. And it actually is a really great way to figure out whether or not you understand the parts of how we equate GDP. So let's put GDP up there just to give you an idea. You can see the GDP over time from 2009 all the way to 2011, fourth quarter of 2011, is increasing at a consistent rate there. So we're increasing GDP. Well, how do we use this to make some sense out of it? Well, let's take a look. What was GDP made out of? Just to give you a real application of this stuff. Remember, GDP is a measurement of the final measurement of the final goods and services, all final goods and services produced in a given year with a certain market value, right? So let's look at some of this stuff. We can look at personal consumption. Remember, that was part of it. C was consumption. We can also look at investment, the I that we were looking at before. We also should be looking at net exports. And also, don't forget G, government consumption. Okay, and so you can see here some of the main parts of how we calculate GDP. Well, if this is GDP in 2011, quarter four, $15,294,000,000,000, there's got to be a way that we can get to that number. How do we get to that number? We add these things together. We add personal consumption. That's about 10.8. We add to that the government consumption and gross private investment is here. Again, you can see that at this point it's 3 trillion plus almost 2 trillion. And net exports is negative $582 billion. You should, when you add these numbers together, and we can look at it in a different format, when we add these numbers together, we should be able to take these, add these three together, subtract the 582 billion, and get a number that's almost exactly what GDP is or was in quarter four of 2011. So you can even see an application of the calculation or how we calculate gross domestic product based on the formula that we were talking about earlier. All right, I hope that this has been informative and that you have some resources that you can play around with yourself. There are a couple of websites for you, and I hope to see you soon. Maybe this will be just one of a couple more in the future. All right, have a great evening, and I will see you next time.